Hello and welcome to Mr. Roberts History. So today we will be looking at the feudal system and the Doomesday Book. These relate to the overall question, how did the Normans change England? So this all comes after William the Conqueror's successful invasion and, spoiler alert in the name, I guess, successful conquering of England from 1066. Because, of course, before he was called William the Conqueror, he was simply William of Normandy. Still a great name, because it means he rules all of Normandy, but William the Conqueror sounds a little bit cooler, I think. Okay, so the Normans have come over. They have conquered England. William is now king. So they need to make some changes. Now, these changes are going to hopefully help keep William in charge and also help him to rule over this new kingdom he's just conquered. So we end up with this thing called the feudal system. Now, very, very simply, the feudal system is a hierarchy where you've got the king at the top and he grants land to the barons. The barons have to provide money and knights to the king. And then you go down a level. The barons grant land to the knights, and the knights have to provide protection and military service to the barons. Then you go down another level and you've got the knights who grant land to peasants, and the peasants have to provide food and services. So it's a hierarchy all the way down. So we've got less people at the top, more people at the bottom. Today we're going to look at these 4 questions. How does the feudal system work? How important were the tenants in chief? And what was the importance of knight service, and how did land holding work in Norman England? So these are our 4 questions. How does it work? What's the deal with tenants in chief, the knights, and land holding? These 4 questions. Okay. So before we look into that, let's do a quick refresher. Let's make sure we understand what it was like before the Normans turned up. So we've got a social system in place where we've got a king at the top. Then we've got earls, and we've got thanes, and we've got peasants, and we've got slaves. So this sounds very similar to the feudal system. Now, this is still a hierarchical system, but it's a little bit more complicated and a little bit more, I don't want to say diverse necessarily, but power isn't as concentrated amongst the few. So there's a few more people with limited amounts of power. Now, that was the problem for William. He's now conquered England, and there's too many people that he has to try and control. So he's going to try and limit where the power is, hence the changes to the social system and the introduction of the feudal system. The feudal system was already in place in Normandy. So that's why he knew how well it worked. So even though we have this similar sort of system, it does change. So the feudal system, how does it work? How important are the tenants in chief? What was the importance of knight service? How did land holding work? So let's go through each one of those. So first things first, how did the feudal system work? Well, William gives land. We can see that from the diagram. But he also gives tax concessions, peace, law, protection in return for loyalty. Now, this is really what is going on. The king is giving some of his land up. He's giving some of his power up to the barons. So the barons are going to stay loyal to him. Okay, so in return for loyalty, knight service, and taxes from the tenants in chief. Now, tenants in chief are the lords, the bishops, the abbots, gave land and privilege to the undertenants, the vassals, in return for military service, and tax the undertenants provided land to the works to the peasants. Some of the free men, majority are bound to one lord, in return for farming and land and rent. So essentially, tenants in chief are kind of basically the knights in this hierarchical system. Okay, so they held their fiefs, known as land, directly from the king. So they are only allowed to have it because the king says they can have it. This is actually similar to how landowning still works in England. So whether or not you're aware of it, sometimes if you're ever paying attention, when you walk past a real estate agent, take a look at some of the advertisements, and they'll say, oh, this is a leasehold property. So if you buy it, you control that property, you control that land, you own it, but only for about 150 years, or maybe 999 years, some of them go up to. But after that time, it goes back to the queen or the king, whoever's in charge at the time. So this is still the case in England today. A lot of the land still technically the people only own it because the king or queen says they can. So this is in terms of how it's changed England, how it has this legacy. It's still actually in place today, of course, in a lesser way. Okay, so there are about 6,000 of these knights in Norman England. The role was to guard their lord's property. When required, they had to provide up to 40 days of knight service directly to the king. Now, they fight on horseback and are very effective for suppressing opposition in England. Now, we need to keep in mind, this is 1066. So usually when you think about the medieval period, you think about knights and people riding their horses and going at each other and having all these contests or jousting and things like that. Most of that actually comes later in the Middle Ages, thinking about more the 1200s and 1300s, as opposed to in 1066. This is the early Middle Ages, the early medieval period. So horses are actually, and knights are actually a relatively new idea in England at this time. So that's why you didn't need as many of them. 6,000 was enough because there wasn't anyone who was opposing them. And then, of course, there's exactly as we talked about, the king technically owns all the land. Now, why did they bring in this feudal system? Like I said, it was about control. Now, this to me is a very, very important aspect. Before the feudal system, before William the Conqueror, land would be inherited to sons. Okay. Now, that meant that if I owned 400 acres of land, for example, and I had two sons and I die, they each get 200 acres of land each. So that means that instead of having one giant landowner, now there's two smaller landowners. That's what I was talking about before in terms of there was more people with a little bit of power as opposed to less people with lots of power. And so they wanted to try and solve this problem. So they brought in this idea, okay? In Norman England, when the landholder died, the heir had to prove his or her loyalty to the king. So you had to prove that you were loyal before you were allowed to inherit the land and pay the king relief, pay the king some taxes in order to secure the land. This made it far more likely you're going to get this loyalty to the king. Because if you're loyal to the king, you get land. Land makes money. Land is kind of like inheriting a company these days. It's not necessarily cash in itself, but it's going to make you money. So if you know being loyal to the king is going to make you money, you're going to be loyal to the king. They also brought in a rule saying only the oldest son could inherit, actually, meaning that that 400 acres of land that belonged to me, if I died, instead of it being 200 and 200 to each son, all 400 goes to just the oldest son. That way, there's less land owners. So there's less powerful people for me to have to check up on. Okay, so this is another benefit of the feudal system. It's all about helping William to take control of this new country that he has conquered, this new land he has conquered. Now, this is a key concept in history. We have the concept of continuity and change, or what's different, what's the same. So we can see in Anglo-Saxon society before the feudal system and Norman society. So slaves make up about just under 10% of the population, and Normans got rid of slavery. So that's, I suppose, a good thing. Peasants made up 90% of the population, and feudalism bound peasants to their lords, and they worked them harder. So this basically stays the same. There were 4,000 to 6,000 thanes, local landowners with more than 5 hides of land with military service. Thanes are wiped out as a landowning class. They are replaced by knights and other vassals. So this other idea. And some earls or barons were powerful and wealthy. They posed a threat to the king. Now, these were replaced by the Normans. So all of those powerful people in England, the Anglo-Saxons, were all replaced, and all the earls became people that William had brought with him from Normandy. And the earldoms were also shrunk. This is because some earls under the Anglo-Saxon system were actually so wealthy and powerful, they could actually challenge the king, such as Harold Godwin, who was a bit of a threat to the previous Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor. Perhaps you've already studied that. If not, we'll see you in the next video. So in terms of continuity and change, Continuity, farming life continued, but it got a little bit stricter. So it got actually a little bit harsher to be a peasant back then. The basics of government pretty much stayed the same, except all the most important people were replaced with Normans. A lot of the taxes stayed the same, and towns kept their exclusive trading rights. However, there are some changes. Trade is reduced, especially with Scandinavia. What that means is, before the Normans took control, there was a lot of trade with the Viking territories of what would be modern day Denmark, Norway, Sweden. This was reduced because they were seen as a threat. So if you trade with them, that enriches them. So we're going to reduce that trade. The military, there are some changes. Castles are introduced, and they start, especially stone castles, they start dominating the landscape. And this helps, again, William to keep control. He also reformed a lot of the churches, knowing that churches are a key element in controlling the people, because church is so important that if you can take control of the church, you'll take control of a lot of people's lives outside of their working on the farm. The feudal system, as discussed, is already put in place, and Anglo-Saxons are removed from all positions of influence. So we're not going to allow these people that we've just conquered to stay in any sort of position where they may pose a threat. So I hope that sort of explains some of the changes they made and how the feudal system plays that role. But just briefly, let's take a look at this question. Why was life so difficult for peasants? Well, peasants lived in these very small, simple one-room cottages. So basically just one square. Imagine just 4 walls. That's your house. They farmed these strips of land, and it was hard. It was very labor intensive. There is also a miller. So maybe you've heard the last name Miller, people with the last name Miller. That probably means they descend from the town Miller, who ground wheat into flour, and a brewer, again, another last name, who made beer, and tradesmen like blacksmiths. So maybe you've heard the last name Smith. That comes from blacksmiths, or maybe carpenters who worked with wood, people with the last name Wood. Okay. Now, in terms of why a brewer who made beer is so important, keep in mind, this is 1066. They don't know how to purify water. And so all they know is people who drink water tend to get sick, but people who drink beer don't. So they actually drank more beer than water, because water supplies were very, very contaminated. But in the process of making beer, the water that you used in that process would get boiled, and it would kill any germs or diseases that were in it. So in actual fact, adults drank beer more than they drank water, which is a fun fact. Now, survival obviously relies on a good harvest. If you got some bad weather and your plants did not come in, sorry, you may be starving that winter. There are no days off. So there's none of this go and work on the farm from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. and then you come home and spend time. No, no, no. Sun's up, get to work. Sun goes down, you can go home. The only days off you got were holy days, so Easter and Christmas, which is one of the reasons they became so important to society. Oh, finally, some time off. Oh, fantastic. This is about time. And that's one of the reasons they became so culturally important. And of course, Sunday on the Sabbath, the 7th day, God rested. So they said, well, peasants, you can have the day off on Sundays. Unless we need you, in which case we'll ask you to work as well, which did also happen. But technically, you're supposed to get Sundays off. Now, peasants also had to pay money to the Lord as rent. They had to pay money to the miller for flour. They had to pay money to the Lord to use the Lord's oven. They're not allowed to have their own. They had to pay the brewer for beer. And this was a price fixed by the Lord, because the brewer had to pay some of that to the Lord as well. And the tithe, 10% of their money goes to the church. And they had to work for the Lord and the church, which was totally unpaid and could take up time needed to harvest their own food. So not only do they have to work on the farm all day harvesting food to make money, but every now and then the Lord might say, I need my fence fixed, come fix it. The local priest might say, oh no, the roof's not started leaking at the church, come fix it. Now, all of that was unpaid. And even though technically they would ask you to do it, you didn't actually have the option of saying no. So that's what life was like at the time for peasants, which brings us to the Doomesday Book. Now, a lot of the roles of peasants is to pay a lot of different taxes. Now, this is what brings us to this question. What was the significance of the Doomesday Book? Well, it was used as a guide to set the taxes of the country. Because remember, a lot of the feudal system is based on taxes, 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 going up, going down, who's collecting what. So it might be an important idea to keep track of who owns what. That is essentially what the Doomsday Book becomes. It's a census. It is a record-keeping service. And it's a way to make sure people are paying the right amount of tax. But it was also very useful to sort out legal disputes, because some people said, that's my land, that's my land. They could check the Doomsday Book. It also was useful to say, hey, we know we've got X amount of men aged 18 to 40. So that's how many people we can put into the army if we ever got invaded by the Danish, for example, or if we ever wanted to invade somewhere else, like the rest of France, which England would go on to do in the coming years. So what is it actually? Well, this comes well after 1066. It actually comes around in 1085. So William commissioned this book, but it actually sort of the work begins to be done in 1086, which recorded who owned which pieces of land in 1066 and 1086 and how much it was worth. So not only was this important to William, but it has been incredibly beneficial for historians, because this widespread record of who owned what, how many people lived where, what sort of work did they do, why did they have more sheep in the north and more farming in the south, subsistence farming, things of this nature. So it's an incredibly useful resource for historians, but it was also very useful for William. Now, in terms of why you would do this, I'm giving you three particular explanations. Financial reasons, in order to receive all the taxes owed. So if you've got a clear record, you know exactly who owes what. Instead of people saying, oh no, I only owe you 2 gold pieces, you can say, I've checked the Doomsday Book, you actually owe me 4, pay up. So that's one reason, to make sure you've got this accurate coverage of tax. Another reason was military. England is under threat from the Danish king. So in order to defend your country, you need to know exactly what you've got available. Maybe even just knowing how many blacksmiths are in the country, so you know how many swords, spears, and arrows could be made. Things like this. There's also the added bonus of the legal system. Since his conquest in 1066, there's very frequent disputes over the land, mainly because William took a lot of the land away from some people and wiped out an entire class of people known as the Thanes. So putting it into writing, legal documentation, meant this would cease to happen. Now, not only are we hopefully now understanding why the feudal system existed to help William keep control, and why the Doomsday Book was commissioned, so he could get an accurate view of the country, and especially an accurate view of taxes. Hopefully, we can actually use this knowledge effectively. Now, before we finish, I'm going to attempt to show you how you can do this. So, the most convincing reason William commissioned the Doomsday Book is financial reasons. Whilst there were some military and legal benefits, the creation of the book itself was about taxes. This shows that financial motivation was the most important. So that's not a bad answer. If someone asked you what's the reason William commissioned the book, that's not bad. It's pretty good. Nah, we'll call it not bad. So that's not a bad answer. Can we do better than that though? Well, hopefully we can. I'm going to try and show you what I mean. So you might say something like, the most convincing reason William commissioned the Doomsday Book was for financial reasons. Whilst there were military and legal benefits, such as the threat from the Danish king in ending domestic land disputes, the creation of the book itself was about taxes, so that William would have a clear record of his subjects and what they owed. This shows that financial motivation was most important. So straight away we can see this one's a little bit more detailed. It's got a little bit more explanation to the answer. So if you were creating an answer for question why did William commission the Doomsday Book? Hopefully we can see that the first one's not bad. It's pretty good, okay? But the second one is even better. But where did I get these answers from? Where did I get this extra detail from? Well, you can see there was this summary of the reasons to create the Doomsday Book. And all I have done is taken several examples from each one. So if I've said the financial reasons are the most important, I've got that in there. He needed a clear record of his subjects and what they owed. William would have a clear record of his subjects and what they owed. I said there were military and legal benefits, and then I've simply said, such as the threat from the Danish king and frequent disputes over land, ending domestic land disputes. So this is what we need to be able to do as historians. When we're answering these questions, we need to justify our answers. We need to give these reasons for our answers. So hopefully, from the course of this video, not only have you been able to learn about the feudal system and the Doomesday Book, but you can see how, from taking that knowledge, how we build up our responses. Of course, I am not saying these answers are perfect. I simply said it is better. And I challenge you to make it better again. Thank you very much. I'll see you in the next video.